All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk about what's going on in the world and U.S. foreign policy leading up to the United States' decision to enter into the war. So President Roosevelt's fervent desire for peace was hardly new. World War I, after all, was meant to be a war to end all wars, and as Woodrow Wilson had said, a war to make the world safe for democracy. In 1933, however, few people believed that the fragile peace established by the Treaty of Versailles would hold up much longer. In Asia, Japan was threatening China. In Europe, the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler had come to power in Germany with promises reasserting German nationalism and militarism. In the United States, worries about the Depression overshadowed the concerns about the Second World War. Even if war did break out, most Americans were determined not to send troops abroad again. However, a second war did happen, and the U.S. played yet again a major role in its fighting. How and why U.S. foreign policy changed from disengagement to neutrality and from neutrality to total involvement is going to be the subject of these videos. Moreover, the war transformed America's economy and society in many ways more dramatically than even the New Deal. So Hoover's foreign policy, not anything startling. Hoover agreed with the prevailing opinion of the American people that the United States should not enter into firm commitments to preserve the security of other nations. Such an opinion in the 1930s is going to be labeled as isolationism. In the early 1930s, Japan posed the greatest threat to world peace. Defying both the open door policy and the League of Nations, Japanese troops marched into Manchuria in September 1939, renamed the territory Manchukuo, and established a puppet government. Despite its commitment to take action against latent aggression, the League of Nations did nothing except to pass a resolution condemning Japan for its actions in Manchuria. When that happened, the Japanese delegation walked out of the League, never to return. And in the Manchurian crisis, the League, through its failure to take action, showed its inability to maintain peace. And its warnings would never be taken seriously by potential aggressors. Here's a political cartoon of Japanese militarism basically just blowing through all of the peace treaties established before the invasion of Manchuria. The U.S. response to Japan's violation of the open door policy was somewhat stronger than the League's response, but no more effective in deterring further aggression. Secretary of State Henry Stimson declared in 1932 that the U.S. would honor its treaty obligations under the Nine-Power Treaty. That was something that was passed in the 1920s, so make sure you check that out if you don't remember what it is. The U.S. would refuse to recognize the legitimacy of any regime like Manchukuo that had been established by force. The League of Nations was quick to endorse the Stimson Doctrine and issued a similar declaration. Again, though, this did nothing to deter Japan. In Latin America, Hoover actively pursued friendly relations. In 1929, even before being inaugurated, the president-elect went on a goodwill tour of the region. As president, he ended the interventionist policies of TR, Taft, and Wilson by arranging for U.S. troops to leave Nicaragua by 1933 and by negotiating a treaty with Haiti to remove all troops by 1934. In his first term, Roosevelt's concentration on dealing with the economic crisis at home kept him from giving much thought to shaping foreign policy. He did, however, extend Hoover's effort in improving U.S. relationships with Latin America by initiating what's referred to as a good neighbor policy. So let's talk about that. In his first inaugural address in 1933, Roosevelt promised a, quote, policy of the good neighbor, end quote, towards other nations of the Western Hemisphere. First, interventionism in support of the dollar diplomacy no longer made economic sense because U.S. business during the Depression didn't have the resources to invest in foreign operations. Second, the rise of militaristic regimes in Germany and Italy prompted Roosevelt to seek Latin America's cooperation in defending the region from potential danger. And FDR implemented this good neighbor policy through several actions. At Roosevelt's direction, the U.S. delegation at the 7th Pan American Conference in Montevideo, Uruguay in 1933, the U.S. pledged to never again intervene in the international affairs of a Latin American country. In effect, Franklin Roosevelt reversed the policy of his older cousin Theodore when Theodore issued the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Another Pan-American conference was held in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1936. Roosevelt himself attended this conference, and he personally pledged to submit future disputes to arbitration, and also warned that if European powers, such as Germany, attempted to commit acts of aggression against us, it would find a hemisphere wholly prepared to consult together for our mutual safety and our mutual good. And so basically, look out because we're unified now. You'll remember that in World War I, one of the factors getting the United States into the war was the Zimmermann Note, which was intercepted, and that was the note from Germany to Mexico trying to persuade Mexico to invade the United States, and then in return, Germany would help Mexico reclaim the land that was taken from them in the Mexican-American War. So FDR personally pledging that he's going to use arbitration rather than aggression in dealing with conflicts, and that the Western Hemisphere is now unified. Cubans had long resented the Platt Amendment, which made their country their country's foreign policy subject to U.S. approval. In 1934, President Roosevelt persuaded Congress to nullify the Platt Amendment, retaining only the U.S.'s right to keep the naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Mexico tested U.S. patience and commitment to the good neighbor policy in 1938 when its president, Lázaro Cárdenas, I'm so sorry if I am pronouncing that incorrectly, seized oil properties owned by U.S. corporations. So he nationalized, one of the big moves of his presidency was his nationalization of the oil companies. So when you nationalize the oil companies, it means that the people owning them no longer own them. However, Roosevelt rejected these businesses' demands to intervene. And he encouraged American companies to negotiate a settlement on their own. This is a very different foreign policy than TR or Taft or even Wilson would have taken during this time period. That this foreign policy is a change from earlier progressive presidents' foreign policy. In terms of the economic policies, helping the United States economy was the chief motivation for Roosevelt's policies towards other foreign policy issues in his first term. So basically, again, the FDR is focused on the United States economy, and that is going to drive his foreign policy, Okay, anything that benefits U.S. economy is going to be a motivator for him. The Republican presidents of the 1920s had refused to grant diplomatic recognition of the communist regime that ruled the Soviet Union. Roosevelt promptly changed this policy by granting recognition in 1933. His reason for doing so, he said, was to increase U.S. trade and thereby boost the economy. And this agreement that the United States is going to have, or these like kind of reluctant allies, the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union tries to be an ally to Hitler's regime. Hitler then invades them, and Stalin is completely shocked. Funny story about that later in class. But it's kind of the concept that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, because the Soviet Union and Germany were opposed to each other. It benefited the United States to ally itself with the Soviet Union. Governing the Philippines cost money. As an economic measure, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to pass the Tydings-McDuffie Act in 1934, which provided for the independence of the Philippines by 1946 and the gradual removal of U.S. military presence from its islands. Acting in the tradition of progressive Democrats such as William Jennings Bryan and Woodrow Wilson, President Roosevelt favored lower tariffs as a means of increasing international trade. You'll remember that the high protective tariffs was one of the results or one of the causes of the U.S. and then global economic collapse. So in 1934, Congress enacted a plan suggested by Secretary of State Cordell Hull, which gave the president power to reduce U.S. tariffs up to 50% for nations that reciprocate. Oh, good gravy. Okay, the U.S. gave the president power to reduce U.S. tariffs up to 50% for nations that reciprocated with comparable reductions for U.S. imports. So if another nation, say France, would reduce its tariffs on U.S. goods, then the United States would do the same. And they would do that for a measure of up to 50% of the tariff. I'm not going to go into too much about what's happening in the rest of the world in these videos. That's going to be something we'll talk a little bit more in class, but this is also something that you focused on last year in world history. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this in class, but I do want to provide a little bit of context, maybe jog your memory. So the worldwide depression soon proved to have an alarming repercussion in world politics. Combined with nationalist resentments after World War I, economic hardships gave rise to military dictatorships in Italy in the 1920s and Japan and Germany in the 1930s. Eventually, in 1940, Japan, Italy, and Germany signed a treaty of alliance which formed the Axis powers. A new regime seized power in Italy in 1922. Benito Mussolini led the Italian Fascist Party, which attracted dissatisfied war veterans, nationalists, and those afraid of rising communism. Dressed in black shirts, the fascists marched on Rome and installed Mussolini in power as Il Duce, or their leader. Fascism, which is the idea that people should glorify their nation and their race through an aggressive show of force, became the dominant ideology in European dictatorships in the 1930s. The Nazi Party was the German equivalent of Italy's Fascist Party. It rose in the 1920s in reaction to the deplorable economic conditions after the war and national resentments over the Treaty of Versailles. The Nazi leader Adolf Hitler used bullying tactics against Jews as well as fascist ideology to increase his popularity with disgruntled, unemployed German workers, non-Jewish German workers. Hitler seized the opportunity presented by the Depression to play upon anti-Semitic hatred. With his personal army of brown shirts, Hitler gained control of the German legislature in early 1933. Nationalists and militarists in Japan increased their power in the 1920s and 30s. As economic conditions worsened, they persuaded Japan's nominal ruler, the emperor, that the best way to ensure access to basic raw materials, because remember, Japan is an island and so it has very limited raw materials. So the best way to ensure access to these raw materials like oil, tin, and iron was to invade China and Southeast Asia, and thereby give Japan control over what their leaders proclaimed to be the Great East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. And here is a political, or is a piece of propaganda, Japanese propaganda, about this Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, because the Japanese sold this basically to not only the people of Japan, but also the people of China and East Asia, that this was supposed to be a unified, let's unify all the Asian nations because we have a similar culture, and fight back the Westerners, and protect ourselves against the Westerners. But in reality, Japan viewed itself as superior and used this as an opportunity to take over other nations. This is an argument that's not exclusive to Japan, by the way. Stalin will do the same thing, as well as Germany to Austria. So this piece of propaganda shows several people of Asian nations smiling and happy, and they're all together and unified. So that's not exactly what happened. Public opinion in the United States was also nationalistic, for sure, but expressed itself in an opposite way of fascism and militarism. Disillusioned with the results of World War I, American isolationists wanted to make sure that the United States would never again be drawn into a foreign war. Japanese aggression in Manchuria and the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany only increased the determination of the isolationists to avoid war at all costs. Isolationist sentiment was strongest in the Midwest and among Republicans. So one of the things that contributed to these isolationist sentiments was in the early 1930s, Americans commonly felt that the U.S. entry into World War I had been a terrible mistake. An investigating committee led by Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota bolstered this view when the committee concluded in 1934 that the main reason for U.S. participation in the World War was to serve the greed of bankers and arms manufacturers. This committee's work influenced isolationist legislation for the following years. And again, remember that Americans were told that they're entering World War I in order to, as Wilson put it, make the world safe for democracy. And this congressional committee concluded that that was basically a lie, that this was about greed and it was about several businesses increasing their market. So as a result of that, isolationists, the United States passes several isolationist measures. Isolationist senators and representatives of both parties held a majority in Congress through 1938. And to ensure that the U.S. policy would be strictly neutral if war broke out in Europe, Congress adopted a series of neutrality acts, which Roosevelt signed with some reluctance. Each law applied to nations that the president proclaimed to be at war. So we have these three neutrality acts. In 1935, the president was authorized to ban all arms and shipments and to forbid U.S. citizens, to travel on the ships of belligerent nations. So it's it's prohibiting the sale of all arms and shipments to belligerent nations and forbidding U.S. citizens to travel on the ships of belligerent nations. Now, what you should be thinking about when you're looking at these neutrality acts is the lessons that people may have learned from World War I and what ultimately got the United States involved into World War I. Okay, and this is basically represented in the neutrality acts as people try to fix this. The Neutrality Act of 1936 forbade the extension of loans and credit to belligerents, and in 1937, the Neutrality Act forbade the shipment of arms to any side of the Spanish Civil War. So let's talk about the Spanish Civil War here for a second. The outbreak of the Civil War in Spain in 1936 was viewed in Europe and the United States as an ideological struggle. And on one side, you had the forces of fascism led by General Francisco Franco. And this was against the forces of republicanism, and they were led by the Loyalists. Roosevelt and most Americans sympathized with the Loyalists, but because of the Neutrality Acts, could not aid them. Ultimately, in 1939, Franco's fascists prevailed and established a military dictatorship. The Spanish Civil War is also going to be a training ground, if you will, for the Nazi Party and military movement in the Nazi Party. So it's kind of like a prelude, essentially, of what's to come. So we will talk about what's to come next video.